So a couple things. I'm Monica Mercado. I am finishing, as Kelly mentioned, in the history department, which means that I am on the border of the humanistic social sciences. So some of the things I have to say about my online communities I think are probably a little different if you're an economist or a sociologist, but I think there are some things that we all share. I work on 19th and 20th century US women's history and religious history. I'm a fellow in our Center for Gender Studies, and I also do a lot of work with archives, which means that I have a lot of kinds of different communities that I've been using my digital profile to connect to. That is to say that the job that Kelly mentioned that I'm starting in July at Bryn Mawr College outside of Philadelphia is actually bringing all of those things together, and in a lot of ways is because I started doing these things the first year I went on the job market. So I'll be directing a center for digital histories of women's education, which actually brings together all of those people. So these are the places you can find me online besides my department profile. And so I thought, Kelly invited me to talk about a little how I got to this place and how it's been helpful to me. And we can also talk about best practices for going beyond the university, I think, digitally. Can I see, do people maintain, you guys all have department profiles on your on your department site? Does anyone maintain an academia.edu? A couple. Does anyone have their own website? Okay. So, does anyone use Twitter? These are the most, okay. So, all right, so good. We're all on the same page. I think a lot of what I'm gonna say today is not new, but which is to say that it's easy. And I think that it has tremendously helped me on the job market, but also thinking about myself as not a grad student at the U of C, but a scholar in public, essentially. So what I wanted to do today is just talk about how I got to this place of deciding I was going to go more online, think about the options, think about best practices, right? What you do and do not want to say, and also posing a bigger question that I think a lot of this has led us to as sort of emerging scholars, is what is the meaning of putting your work online and open access, which I think is a whole other discussion that I wouldn't have even thought about until I got to the place that I was about to graduate. And the last thing I want to say about getting started is that about a year ago, I went to a conference on digital history, which has become a huge trend in my field. And I introduced myself by saying that I was a complete digital dinosaur. So it's kind of amazing. And I think it's a testament to using some of these things that within a year, I'm about to graduate and move to this sort of digital position. In a job talk and an interview process where I said, I don't code, I don't do X, Y, and Z fancy things, but I do know how to connect people and connect a conversation, and I know what other people are doing, and other people know what I'm doing. And I think that was really important when I was on the market. Because who sees our work? I came to grad school from the museum field, so I was used to curating exhibitions that are up for a couple of months and then go away. I've done that here at U of C. Like many of you, just published my first paper journal article. It will probably show up eventually on Project Muse. It's not yet, but who actually sees and reads this stuff, of course, is always the concern. And so I really started thinking about this a lot last academic year, 2012-13, the first year I went on the job market. I had a writing fellowship. I had taken a year off, so a lot of my cohort had graduated, and I felt like I needed new conversation partners the year that I was just kind of sitting and writing. And I also realized that my department, the bios of all the grad students on our department website aren't updated every time you do something new, and I wanted to have something a little more flexible that I could link to. And there were a couple of other reasons. I could tell digital was becoming important in my field of history as its own concern. I mean, this is more a talk about social media, but I knew that there were people having conversations, and I was feeling left out of those conversations. And then, to be very honest, in terms of gender, when I looked to see how other people were presenting their CVs and media online, I saw a lot of my friends and colleagues who were men, who had great websites, and less women. And I was really frustrated thinking that this kind of group of guys in my fields of history and religious studies were kind of controlling the conversation. And they were great, they're my friends. They were blogging, they were tweeting, they had great websites, and I didn't see that as much, and I thought I needed to be part of that. So I Googled myself, and I had done this, around the time you start proposing, right? You're proposing your dissertation and going and doing conferences, and while this is on the right is me signed out of Google, and I Googled myself last night, and I was very happy with the results. But my joke in the first couple of years of being at conferences and being a grad student was that a woman named Monica Mercado in California had sadly run over her ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend. And so while these are kind of tame now, for a long time, if you Googled me, everything that came up before U of C was Monica Mercado is the worst person in the world. Literally, there was a website called that. So I wanted that to change, and I had done enough things on campus where that was changing. And so again, I haven't thought very deeply about search engine optimization and those sorts of things, but once you start putting more of yourself out there on Twitter, on a website, and even have more links on your department site, those start popping up. And obviously now I'm intrigued by what I've just learned from Renee in terms of YouTube and video. And this I thought was very important when I was going on the market, because I could tell from academia.edu that if I went to conferences, things were pinging. I wanted a way to sort of see this more. And I did think a lot about what I actually had the time and interest and ability really to manage. So this is why I said nothing I'm saying is particularly new, but I knew I had a department profile on the history site, like I said, that I knew wasn't updated all the time. So I gave them the link to my own website where I update my CV when it needs to be updated. I knew I had a profile on gender studies where I have a fellowship. So I knew that there were those things that I could link to an outside presence. I don't love academia.edu because I do a lot of different things. So like I said, I think that it's a kind of I like a certain look. I don't like the sort of look of it. I felt like it didn't represent the sort of public scholarship I do in terms of talks, exhibitions, what we call public history. So I think that it's still something that many of us have an update, but I decided to, and I don't use LinkedIn, but I know that increasingly I see PhDs and faculty even on LinkedIn, so I can't speak to that. So I really decided to go with the last three. I also, just because I'm a historian, I pulled my first tweet last night just to see what it was. It was the first day of the 2012 fall quarter when I was sitting in my new office as a fellow by myself with my computer having to finish my dissertation. And I was like, wow, I feel really alone. And so a good friend of mine who's at the Brookings Institution was very excited that I joined. But I knew that there were conversations happening. And I knew that I also, and I don't have a picture of it, but I started a very basic WordPress site. It was free. I haven't upgraded it. It served my needs so far, where I have links to my projects, my teaching, my CV. The teaching part I think is important because a lot of us are teaching and teaching really interesting stuff, but nobody's in our Chalk or Blackboard site. So it was important for me to create some online representations of my syllabi and courses for people to see as I was going on the market. And then group blogs may be more specific to my field of history. There are there are increasingly a lot of blogs in US history, which is my sort of biggest field, that have sort of collaborators and invite posts. And again, I saw people I knew being invited to these things. And I thought it was really smart to try to be present in some way in those conversations. I've really taken to Twitter. I think I mentioned that my work moves among different fields and also different professionals. So in history, there's even a hashtag, the Twitterstorian. There's a very big community of us, as well as librarians and archivists, and feminist theorists in gender studies. I've seen political scientists, increasingly professional conferences have a hashtag. And so Twitter's been really useful for me. And that's a screenshot just of my website. So in an About Me, where I can talk a little bit more broadly about my work than on the department site, there's a sort of synopsis page of my dissertation with links to my journal article and blog posts that I've written. So again, very bare bones. I mean, I'm really excited with what Renee has to say, but once with this WordPress site, I can see the fact that it's being visited every day. I can see when that's really happening. Of course, it's usually around conferences or places I'm at. But with Twitter, I have met an amazing group of people in my fields across rank, which I think has been really interesting. But it is also why I knew going into this that I wanted to create a certain persona, which really, is my persona, but makes Twitter an interesting place that can also sometimes go wrong. So I think you might be able to see if you visit my Twitter. It's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek and scholarly. So I call myself a lady scholar and scholar of ladies. It's something that women's historians have sort of bandied about for a while, but I also mark that I am interested in American religious history. Thinking about your Twitter bio is just kind of useful for people to put you in place. I pulled these sort of best practices from Miriam Posner, who's a friend of mine in UCLA who works on DH and digital humanities, and she had a great list that I sort of amended that I think is really helpful for thinking not just about if you're going to be using Twitter professionally, but also creating a voice in a blog, or thinking about the ways that you're interacting online. I wanted to be myself, but I also wanted to think about the boundaries of the site. So on my Twitter, I very rarely am going to tweet about what I'm eating for lunch or where I'm going on vacation, unless that vacation has to do with women's history, as it did when I went to Seneca Falls last summer. And then I, sort of broke that line of it's not just about research. Twitter is not good if you are an argumentative, combative person. You don't want to be getting on fights. You don't really want to be trash talking the U of C or anywhere else that you're sort of moving. My sort of feeling to myself as I watch people, not just grad students, faculty on Facebook and these sorts of things, a screenshot can be grabbed of anything is my feeling with this. I try to be consistent. So if I'm trying to generally tweet out work that I think is interesting of my own, having to do with the fields that people know that I am sort of working in. I mentioned the hashtags, learning the conventions, particularly of Twitter. There's a hashtag for women's history, for historians. Conferences increasingly are sort of publicizing what their hashtag is, and also their policies. Do you need to ask before you tweet a conference panel? I thought a lot about the audiences I wanted to reach. Again, I knew in the back of my mind I was going to be Googleable and Googled as a job candidate. But I also wanted, to be able to speak to people who are, working in a small historic house museum or just generally interested in, Susan B. Anthony and stumbled across my site. Edit, obviously. And I think the last three, particularly the last two, I think of Twitter and blogging as really a collaborative venture. I think that we are taught to be very, sort of hold tight to our work and view each other as competitors, right? We're competing for the same jobs, we're in the same space. One of the reasons, in fact, that I'm taking kind of a job that's a little bit different than that is that I just naturally am really interested in other people's work in different archives. But I think that blogging and Twitter and having this online persona works best if you are interested and want to engage with other scholars. And so you're sharing your work. Like, certainly, I think it was a learned position to sort of promote myself. I think I sort of, if you happen across my blog, you'll notice that it really for a while was just sort of an extended CV. I knew I was on the market, and so if I was giving talks, I would sort of post about that. And increasingly, I'm starting to think about how I want to use that blog to talk about kinds of work. But certainly, by being generous with others, when I'm excited about an article or a post that someone I know has written that I think is great, then I'm going to tweet about it. That person is not a competitor to me. That person is my colleague, and they're then going to be sharing your work. And the last thing I'll say that, like I said, I think is kind of maybe unique to history and certainly more the humanities. These are the kinds of places where I blog. Once I had an online presence, I was actually asked by Religion in American History, where I'm now a contributor, to give a guest post on something related to my research, and I now write a blog for them once every other month that I switch off with a friend of mine who's a postdoc in Toronto. There's a lot of different collaborative blogs in US history that go by this model, but once I had something online and people saw that I was doing stuff or saw me tweeting, I got a lot more asks. So Oxford Academic, which is the blog of Oxford University Press, asked me to write a post on an oral history project I'm working on that got far more, readership than any of that paper. I mean, we know the paper stuff that we are producing. It's not that I have a book from OUP, but it's exciting to work with their editors and create a post with some images and some work that also linked back to my sites. Even on campus, so if you work on anything having to do with religion, the Martin Marty Center Sightings invites all kinds of short essays, 500 to 700 words. And Sightings goes out to a pretty big audience. People love Martin Marty, and it gets sent around. And they're really based on sort of newsworthy things, but you can pitch stories to their editor, Miriam. So there are things happening on campus. It's not that I'm just sort of leaving, U of C for these things. But again, as I got to the point that I was both in my headspace of writing all the time, but also thinking afield and knowing that I was going to be putting things out there. And I think I'll just end for a quick minute with a couple of very tangible results. I was trying to think if I'd done anything really wrong. And I can't remember if anything's gone particularly bad. Some things are out of your control. I think I tweeted something once to a scholar in a field. And he said, "Oh, that's so great. I hope you're talking to so-and-so who is and tweeted at so-and-so who was a really big scholar in the field, and it was like a Friday night. I was like, I was not ready to talk to so-and-so. I'm in my pajamas, So I mean, some of that stuff is out of your control, and it is something to manage, and you have to think about the time you really want to spend. Certainly for me, writing a dissertation has been a nice distraction, but sometimes it is a distraction, or there's a conversation or something gets misread. But the things that I want to end, and then we can go to questions, to say that in the last couple of years, because of Twitter, I am generally now meeting all kinds of new scholars, junior and senior scholars at conferences who I've started a conversation with on Twitter and then meet in real life. That has actually led me to the job that I'm taking. I blogged about a class I was teaching in the fall for Religion in American History, and a woman I really respect who works in a related field at Yale emailed me out of the blue and said, "Wow, I loved your blog post. We have this postdoc, you should think about applying for this in January." And so again, it's like I wrote this blog post in my pajamas, right, sitting at home, and now I'm having a conversation with someone I really, really respect in this field. And again, this idea of the sort of sharing research, having more people see your stuff. I mean, I blog in a lot of ways around my general fields. It's not specifically tied to my dissertation, but the last thing I'll say is that I do think a lot about what my voice should be, what my expertise is, and what I do want to share at this point. Because I know that certainly I'm also going to need in my field is still a book field. I know I'm still going to have to publish something depending on the places I want to advance. So I think about, what parts of my research aren't crucial or probably aren't going to make it to the book. I'm not going to give it all away for free, but I am very interested in, in open access and thinking about the fact that I don't want all of my work to sort of hide embargoed in ProQuest. I do actually want to share it. And those are conversations that differ from field to field, advisor to advisor. But I decided to do a little post for Religion and American History on a tiny piece of my dissertation, and a faculty member from a college in Vermont emailed me and said, "Oh, I've been doing a project on this same place, and I have all these databases, and I'd love to share them with you. If you ever," and I'm from upstate New York, so I'm actually near Vermont quite often, and I spent a lovely day in the fall in Vermont with a more senior scholar in my field who, at a photocopier where he literally, gave me all kinds of wonderful research that he had started that he thought would be useful to me. I mean, I know that's kind of an extreme example, but I think that if you think about this as being sort of generous and willing to sort of learn and have these conversations, good things have come out of it, and it's been incredibly useful for me as a job candidate. So I ran over a little. I guess we should talk. And I'm gonna have to scoot out right at noon, but certainly, I'm happy, both of us, I think, to chat and to email if people have questions. Like I said, these are all things that are free and there that we might already use, but thinking about how using them best.